Okay, so I'm calling this ecosystem decoding, learning from the past to understand the present and to plan and predict for the future. And what I really want to touch on is sort of the differences between archaeology and ecosystem science and evidence of change, and how our forests have really sort of changed over the last 160 years. And in a lot of cases, it may be just a little small centimeter layer that's under the moss that you can't even really see it unless you're looking for it. You actually dig down into the soil. But there's some comparisons and some similarities between, say, archaeology and ecosystems and learning what's happened out there in our ecosystems, and there's some differences as well. So there's a nice piece of probably Amazon rainforest with a river running through it, but it's no different. That's what a lot of people think too, that ecosystems are different all over the world, but realistically, the species may change, the plant species, the animal species, but still there's all the same kind of concepts. We have predators at the top of the food chain, and we have the producers or the grazers who go in and eat the vegetation, and then that goes up the energy goes up the food chain. But still, you've got predators, you've got habitat needs. These forests still do the same kind of jobs that they do all over the world, that they take in carbon dioxide, turn it into wood, store carbon, produce oxygen, slow down and filter water, store carbon under the ground, and provide habitat and cool and shade the planet. So the characters or the actors may be different around in these different ecosystems, whether you're in a cold ecosystem in the north, or you're in a wet tropical ecosystem, or you're in a temperate ecosystem like we are here, where it's not too hot and not too cold. But it's still the same concepts, and how we've managed these forests, in particular along the west coast of North America, and the systems we've used, the science that's been used, the policies, all those have impacted. And in a lot of cases, what they've discovered in the States and what we discover here, it's really interchangeable between Alaska and California and in a lot of other places too. So we just need to understand how these ecosystems are different and go forward from there. So I also want to talk about layers, because the information that we have about our ecosystems and about the changes that have happened is recorded in a lot of neat places. So that helps us too. If we only have this little centimeter layer of material or burn layer under the moss that tells us something's happened in that ecosystem through time, whether it's natural or where it's human caused, well, a lot of those cases, that information is recorded in growth rings. It's recorded in the soil layers there. It could be recorded in the lake sediments, and then also in the ice cores as well, or the ice cave, like is showing here, where changes to these ecosystems and the plants that were there, the changes in carbon dioxide amounts in the atmosphere and oxygen, all of that is recorded, and how much rain or drought or those types of things, and fires as well too, is recorded, or volcanic explosions is recorded in all of these layers. So we can go back and go back to these different data sources and collect information from them that'll tell us what happened 100 years ago, 200, 5,000, 10,000, or even a million years ago. As I'll show you coming up here in the next kind of slide, there's even in the soil layers, there's actually a huge defining line of the time with dinosaurs and the time without dinosaurs after the big meteorite hit the Yucatan Peninsula. So there's lots of information that can be gained, but in a lot of cases too, that from our forested areas too, it makes it really difficult because those forests are still growing. So we can stand on the same ground that the people that cut the forest down 100 years ago, we can stand on the same soil, literally the same ground, and the forest is still growing. So it's hard, it's not a hard time in the sand or buried in a soil layer where time sort of stops like in an archaeological dig. These forests keep on growing, and so history keeps on going, but it's hard to see that history if you don't know what you're looking for. So there's a good example there too, that the dark layer above, you can see it in the brown layer below, And that line is the very line where the dinosaurs disappeared. When that meteorite hit, there was a big, huge fireball that went around the earth, and ash clouds in the sky that killed all the vegetation. But underneath that yellow line there's dinosaur fossils, and above that line there is no dinosaur fossils, and that's recorded in the soil layer. So there's neat that we have this kind of defining moment 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs disappeared because of the meteorite blast. And similarly here in Guatemala, they're digging down way down. Well, the time several thousands years ago is like 60 feet deep down there, because of course through time soil keeps getting built up. But this is, all these different layers tell us stories about what happened in that time, and the artifacts that are in those holes tell us what happened. There aren't any written records for the most part in these earlier times, but we have this little bit of a material information that's in that pit that we can find out what happened 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, and help us explain what happened at that time. And here on our own, close to home, up near Bella Bella, then we have deep pits as well too that go down back to 14,000 years ago in some of the earliest habitations of First Nations on the coast. So again, going through the layers, finding a little fire pit where they were burning, where they're processing food, dumping their remains of food processing into middens, and you have shells, you have fish bones, and all those types of things. Again, telling the information about those stories and those different levels. And here we got like the city of Troy too, where you've got maybe 12 different cities of Troy built on the same spot, and each of them in a different configuration with walls and with fortifications, or maybe canals coming through or water coming through to feed the site, amphitheaters. So again, there's all these different kind of patterns that are out there. All of these are showing what civilization changed that one site, or the archaeological dig showing where the First Nations lived. There's patterns, there's evidence, there's information that can be garnered from those sites to figure out what happened through the many hundreds, thousands, and millennia, through time. So we can use that information to figure out what's happened. And similar here too with post holes, and that up in the upper left-hand corner, if you find these in the ground and you're digging down through the layers, you can see that there used to be a post, or somebody maybe wobbled a post, or the post is still in position, but each of them is going to record what happened on that particular spot in that archaeological site. And down the lower right-hand corner is kind of neat too, that leads to this. So they're doing a big Crossrail program in London, England, and where you've got the geological bedrock, you've got Roman suburbs, you've got medieval Mooresfield Marsh, you've got the Bedlam Hospital burial grounds and Victorian foundations and sewers, and then the modern City of London above that. So at each one of those layers, they got more and more information. And as you get closer to us in time, then what's kind of neat from historical point of view is that then the document record starts playing a part as well. Because so in the later years, you've got down in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you actually have the paper records associated with the burial grounds and who was actually buried there. And then you also in other places have their wills and property deeds. So then you can actually connect this archaeological information with historical information, start putting together who those people really were, and maybe even finding out their names. So you're linking these archaeological artifacts with historical records, and where something in, say, in the Roman suburbs, you're not going to know the name of the people. You'll just find their skeletons and maybe their villas or homes and houses or roads, but it's still not as detailed of information as you can collect from having the written records and written documents. So as again saying, like the city of Troy here, just again to show you the patterns, and then to head off into the forest world, the ecosystem world, and see what kind of patterns are out there that maybe we could be gleaning as we're walking through the forest, and figure out what's happened on that forest. So there's patterns are everywhere. They're in nature. There are changes that are caused by human. There's patterns that are caused by civilization. And In some cases, there's similar patterns between in forested ecosystems from natural and human causes, but also there's many differences. And these changes that occur, in a lot of cases, we're just seeing what's above ground, and maybe that change is one tree or a patch of trees or a forest or a landscape or a region. So there's a variety of scales that we can look at these different changes as well, and whether it's a natural cause or a what they call anthropogenic or a human cause. And so a lot of cases in our looking at forested ecosystems, these changes can be caused by logging or forest fires or windstorm and or disease and decay. And so like disease and decay could work on one tree at a time. So maybe one tree will eventually get a disease or become decayed and then fall over. Well, that's sort of single tree death. But in a lot of cases, you maybe have a windstorm, so you're impacting more of an area and a whole bunch of trees blow over and some stay standing. Well, then you've got a bigger effect going from there. And then you got things like forest fires and logging where you could cover thousands and thousands of hectares. So there's a variety of patterns, and what happens at each types of those, what we call disturbances, then will determine what pieces of the previous ecosystem get forwarded to the future. But it also, if we know where those clues are out in the forest, we can actually see what happened in time. So if we see a whole bunch of trees blowing over in the same direction, we have a good idea that a wind came from behind us and blew them over. Or if we see darkened stumps or darkened trees and logs that have been blackened by fire. So all these sort of visual clues tell us what the changes are and those patterns help us identify what's happened. So there's some examples there. On the upper left-hand corner, you've got some harvesting that's happened up on the hillside. On the right-hand side, you see the blast from 1980 at Mount St. Helens, which changed in a huge way, like that boundary layer between the dinosaurs and no dinosaurs, that KT boundary from 65 million years ago. Well, in an instant, 150,000 acres were changed. Mountains were moved and rocks slid into lakes and splashed it up into the air, and then it came back down again, blew over millions and millions of trees, scorched them dead standing. Hot mud flows flowed onto the landscape. And so there's patterns there as well in a natural system. And then in the upper left-hand corner, harvesting, well, the man-caused system, there's a cut block that then some harvesting and maybe a little bit of retention has occurred in. And down below, we've got a big, huge old springboard stump that's now habitat for moss and lichen and salal growing on the top. But again, too, that here is a clue that if you just sort of see it or it's in the shadows, you're not going to notice that. But you know, in some cases, they might have had 45 to 65 big springboard stumps per acre. So those are all indications and patterns and information that we can pull in to figure out what's happened on this site. Here, example 2 is there's probably a natural log that went down a long time ago, but it's a nurse log. So we have an idea based on the size of the tree there, how long ago maybe how long that tree has been living there. And if there was no cut ends on that log, we have a good idea that log blew down many, many years ago in a natural process and has now become a nurse log. But there's little visual clues that can tell us that is this been caused by man or a natural system, and we can go through and read and have a good idea. Similarly, we can see you know, up on the hillside there, we see the yellow, that's all larch, which is a conifer that loses its needles in the wintertime, or, you know, that turns yellow and then loses its needles. So in the fall, just like a deciduous tree, it turns color as well. So in the regular part, or for most of the year, that's going to be green. But in the fall, when it's turning colors, then you can see, oh, there's something kind of different going on that hill. Well, it's a deciduous conifer that turns yellow and then drops its needle, just like the trees with leaves do as well. So there's a pattern on the hillside too. So all the yellow you can see there way up on the hillside there, those are all larch trees. But in a different time of year, you might not be able to see that unless you can get to the base of them. So there's neat patterns from the scale of a squirrel taking cones and taking the seeds out of them, or the bark beetles engraving their galleries to lay their eggs under the bark on this log in the lower right hand corner there too. But those are all little changes that are happening and they describe what's happening in that ecosystem. So you can see them. Oh, you can see sawdust on the bark. Well, you have an idea that a particular tree, as it's dying, then is being attacked by bark beetles. And then you have an understanding, oh, there's something happening in this forest, and we probably should read the signs and see what's going on. So there's a down log too, where this become a nurse log, and then the big log down the middle there too. Maybe a big windstorm came through, but these are all clues on what's happened. And now what are those sort of what are called biological legacies? What are they becoming? Well, they're nurse logs. They're providing nutrients, inputs into the soil. They eventually will become soil. They're water sponges, because that log on the top there is covered with moss and lichen and sword fern, and their habitat for salamanders. So how did that get here? Chances are the log above there was probably cut down a long time ago and left, or it could have been left there naturally as well too. So all these little kind of stories tell us about our forested ecosystem. And in this case here too, you've got a forest fire went through here in 2002. This is in southern Oregon. The Biscuit Fire covered 500,000 acres. So does this, this certainly hasn't been logged, but then it's giving us clues. But then this forest could also look very similar to like the Mount St. Helens, because there's lots of dead standing at Mount St. Helens too. But by going in and knowing the history, you can figure out what's happened on these lands. And here's some other things too. There's a cedar tree that's been burnt up into the middle there too. So we know that fire happened on that spot. And if we went and did some carbon-14 dating, we could actually tell when that fire went through. But just clues of what's happened on the forest. We've got another fire in the upper right-hand corner there, and in the lower left-hand corner was actually some harvesting where they actually left a few trees too. So there's some an actual harvesting history from that site, as opposed to say that site in the upper left-hand corner in the Gold Stream watershed near Victoria, where some beautiful old growth, maybe a fire went through 500 years ago, but it's in a different kind of a successional path than the forest that now is harvested, where some trees were left. So it's really neat clues to try and figure out what's happened. And there's also patterns and changes from logging as well, in particular, because we've gone from 100% old growth 100 years ago to now, in some cases, less than 1% of old growth forests. And to try to figure out, nobody really does this. Nobody really goes back and looks at the historical record from harvesting, or those documents or reports that luckily historical societies like Ladysmith and District Historical Society have. There's records, there's maps, there's information that could be used to figure out how have these forests changed in the surrounding areas. So speaking of patterns, you've got skid roads where they used to use with horses and oxen to pull the logs out. You can still go find those skid roads on in the forest, on the forest floor, and those logs that are lying, those skid logs, were at a regular intervals between them, because they knew that the logs couldn't dip down. So you can go find those patterns out on the landscape, and you could see that now. You can see those rotting logs. Well, you'll know that that was logged with oxen or horses, as opposed to a railroad or a logging road. So then you have an idea that that this was probably done, logging that was done pre-1880 or into the 1890s, and so we started getting mechanical machinery like this one here. 1880s Chemainus Dolebeer steam donkey with one drum, where they drag the logs along the ground. And that system, they used that system up until about 1908, when they got systems like this on the coast, where they put up spar trees and could reach out 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet. And if you did a whole bunch of them together, in some cases, they could reach out 10,000 feet if they did what was called cold deck swing. So the size of the area you could impact in your logging, dragging the logs along the ground or doing them with ox and horse, and is definitely different than the pattern of how they were harvested is definitely different than a system that can reach out 10,000 feet. So those kind of patterns are written on the hillsides if we know what to look for. Or if you came and that spar tree was still left and you can see a lot of debris here, well, they used to pile up all the logs, pull them in from the surrounding hillsides, and you may be able to find that sort of debris feel from the logs that were hauled away, but all the accumulation of debris at what's called a landing. So that can be sitting out as a clue to you and tell you, oh, by the way, this is a landing, and there's the railroad went by here as well too. But creating a pattern in the landscape that people will just walk by and not know that, oh yeah, that's a landing, and there was a spar tree. Maybe you can find the big the spar tree may be still standing, or there's a great big stump where it was. And there's some examples from Yubo there too. And here's a debris field from out near Haney and Maple Ridge, but then showing all the logs and the wood that's there too. So there's this all kinds of changes to these landscapes, and how much did they take and how much did we leave, and that tells the story of how those ecosystems are going to recover going forward. In a lot of cases, like here in Ladysmith too, we did a lot of on the ground kind of hauling. This is how they logged up and behind Ladysmith starting in 1936, because there was a big windstorm in about 1934, and they came in and they used the technology, this cat arch system like they had up in Campbell River and Courtenay after the big 1938 fire event that happened up there that covered 80,000 acres. So they brought the same kind of technology, because the company Comox Logging came from that Courtenay area and came down here to Ladysmith to start operations. So there's an example here too of loading rail onto cars and rail cars and taking them down to the mill. And at one time too, we had 5 different rail operations dumping logs into Ladysmith Harbor. We had, there was the Timberlands Company, there was one called Bratton Portage, there was another one, I think, up in the Nanaimo Lakes area as well, and there was also one from Jump Lake. There was a Blodell operation, I believe. And there was one other one. And then even in later years, we were hauling logs from Port Renfrew, came here and dumped them in the harbor here in Ladysmith. So all kinds of different impacts. And as it turns out, the guy on the left there standing on the springboard is my grandpa, and he came down here in 1936 to help from Courtenay to open up the Comox logging operation here in Ladysmith. So there's human history there too, which luckily the archives has a lot of that kind of information too, the genealogy, the families, and my grandpa was a Finn, so there was lots of Finns in logging here in Ladysmith, and on the coast there was tons and tons of Finn loggers, so there's all kinds of connections there. But to figure out too, not only the people that did this and the changes to the ecosystems, but trying to figure out how did cities grow and towns and the economy, and a lot of that information is located in the archives. Insurance maps for fire insurance maps for the town of Ladysmith I know exist, and so these archives are unique locations where a lot of this historic information reports that if it doesn't exist there, it doesn't exist anywhere. That'll help us explain not only how these ecosystems have changed, but also how our economy and people and families and societies, how that has all evolved. And these historical records that may be just one of a kind are our way to link and also having things like locomotives and humdurgans and the actual physical tools that these guys used out in the woods. We have them as artifacts, and we also have historical air photos and records, and to explain our whole life, how we've changed the ecosystems and how our towns have developed. So there's some more modern logging and some patterns across the hillside as well too. How did they log these areas? And there's a railroad area there too, but in particular, railroad logging too was so pervasive, as you can see there, like at the bottom there, 4 million acres that were logged in coastal BC using railroad logging, and in Western Washington, Oregon, 10 million acres. So they made a huge change to these ecosystems, but in some cases that they actually left tons and tons of equipment, tons and tons of wood out there on these areas, like and trees as well. So you can see there that in a lot of cases, they left 4 seed trees per acre, 4 dead trees per acre, 16 to 25 other trees per acre, 140 logs per acre. So in a lot of cases, they left lots of carbon out there. And I think those kind of physical resources are going to be long-term carbon storage, but nobody actually includes it in their carbon accounting because it doesn't exist. They don't know what to look for. They don't know what clues to look at. So what I would also suggest is that in a lot of cases after the railroad logging, forest fires came through. And for every acre they were logging, 1 acre was getting burned, and there was also a 4% annual reburn rate. So what I suggest is that those post-railroad logging fires that had so much woody material left out there, and then the fires that came after, I think that they replicated or maintained the prehistoric fire regimes, because our Douglas fir forests are a fire ecosystem. So I think it was, there's comparisons to what we call now ecosystem-based management or ecological forest management, where we're actually trying to go, if we're going to do harvesting, and retain big old standing trees, big dead trees, logs in the ground, patches of trees. And by accident, I think this railroad logging system is very comparable to this sort of ecological based, ecosystem based management or ecological forest management type of system. And what this kind of data too is like, science is always looking for long-term data. Well, if we go back and research these sites, we'll actually have sort of like a time machine where we can, because it's so well documented, we can go back in time and see what they did and how much wood they left out there, and the patterns and how big the cut blocks were and the fires that came afterwards, that we can sort of go backwards and forwards in time and see what those forests looked like then, or how they were impacted then, and what do they look like now, to help actually make the case for ecological forest management or ecosystem-based management. Because our current systems are aimed at retaining patches of the previous ecosystem, like a forest fire or a windstorm does. It takes material from the previous ecosystem and forwards it to the future. And that's what accidentally railroad logging did a lot. Our current logging takes basically 95% of the logs away and leaves very little material out there. So that's the kind of connections I'm trying to make. And these historical records that are out there, that are in libraries and archives, can help make that case with the clues that are on the ground. So the Ladysmith and District Historical Society, I think, is in an important spot. It has a role that it has all this kind of information as a keeper of knowledge and the documents and of artifacts that tell the story of the local area and the wider area. And maybe one-of-a-kind collections that don't exist elsewhere, like family photo collections. And literally all of this information is 1 second away from the garbage can. As people go through and clean out their relatives' homes, as these people have unfortunately passed away, taking their knowledge with them, but then the family is left with having to try and clean that house out. So I think there's the historical societies and archives just are so important to be holders of knowledge, keepers of knowledge, and that when the people who experience all of this, they're gone, this is the record that we're going to have of that. And things like here, like different kinds of maps that can show us what was left on the ground in the form of round, you can see round stumps there and logs on the ground. Or we can put these air photos together and then make a series and see changes over time and patterns. What has that change been out there? We've got old historical maps that are outlined. You can see a little red and yellow there lines. Well, that's forest fires from down in the Columbia Gorge. Historic air photo here from Yubo that shows the logging from the 1920s from a 1946 air photo. So showing what those changes are, and that air photo is a record of that. And we can go out onto the ground and we can find where that boundary is, where you can see the sort of the the white area. We can actually go find that boundary still on the ground up above Yubo, and see where the rails were, maybe where the spar trees were, find those springboard stumps and the patches of trees that were left on that hillside. Because for the most part, since the 1920s now, so basically coming up on 100 years ago, that hillside hasn't been logged except for a couple little spots and then way up on top. But this hillside is so steep, but there we can connect the archival documents and records and information that tells us what happened, and then we can match that with our on-the-ground observations and find out what's happened. How's that ecosystem today? And we've got neat things like this. We've got pictures of lots of archival pictures that tell us the machinery they used out there in the center there, you can see where it says area slash. Well, that's actually a blueprint from a post-fire, post-railroad logging and post-fire plot down in Oregon from 1925 that actually tells how much burning there was and how intense it was, and then there were seedlings. It's like literally a blueprint of the plot, and then gives you the dimensions and this. So again, incredible information from that one section. I have 12 plots just like that, like 12 blueprints of each plot, and then a report that goes with that for that area in Central Oregon. And if I didn't have that and it didn't exist, then we wouldn't be able to tell the story of that area. And that information is relevant to here too, because that's a Douglas fir forest down there, and similar to here, similar technology, similar policies. So we can transcribe that information from Oregon all the way up here to coastal BC and onto the island. So there's interchange of information that is applicable in all kinds of places that we can make comparisons and see if we can find the same kind of effects on the ground here. So that's kind of neat. So what I like to say is that decoding these ecosystems is a bit of a detective story. That the patterns and changes on the landscapes are in plain sight, but they're really hidden unless you know what to look for. The layer from the past 160 years is only about 1 centimeter deep, and it's under the moss and lichen on the forest floor. So, and when we're out in the forest in these ecosystems, we're standing literally on the same ground as the loggers did many years ago. So it's not changed. It hasn't changed like places like London, where it's many, many layers deep from the Romans to modern time. So it makes it difficult, and it's like time keeps on going in the forest because the forest keeps on growing, whereas in an archaeological site and covered in meters and meters of soil, time is sort of has stood still and is trapped on that layer or at the bottom of that pit 14,000 years ago up coast near Bella Bella. So but in a lot of cases too, that we are only, if the only clues we're going to see are really is there's trees and logs and stumps that were left. That's our only sort of clues that that something has happened on that site. And a new forest then sort of obscures that as well too. So you've got to be really looking at what you can see. That's right. So the forest, it's hard to see the changes and patterns because the forest is still growing and time hasn't stood still like an archaeological site. But there's an opportunity to combine field observations with documents, photos, and reports. And so we can try and see what kind of changes and patterns and how our forests and our ecosystems have changed over the past 160 years. So I like to call it learning from the past to understand the present, to plan and predict the future. And I think that railroad logging, and realistically all logging, can be taken, and we need to do more than just sort of look on Google Earth and see, yeah, there's that area was harvested, but actually to do the drill down into the information to see how does that forest change, or from railroad logging or from a forest fire. And so with that information, these railroad logging and forest and large forest fires too are ecological time machines. And if we can take the on the ground evidence and combine that with the historical evidence and documents and reports that live in archives that are staying there waiting to be discovered by somebody who's interested in what we can find from them, then I think we can really find get some really good understanding about how these forests change, because at the most, people can just say that forest was cut, and that's about as far as they go. But there's way more stories to be told, just like that Mount St. Helens there, where they've been working now for 40 years, seeing what happened at that blast and how the areas recovering over the last 40 years. So there's huge understanding that needs to be brought together so we can understand how we change these ecosystems and see how are they going to be prepared as we go forward in the face of climate change and more needs for people still want to have forestry and logging and provide jobs. So how is it we can have less of an impact on these forested ecosystems? And the only way to do that is to understand them, use the best science we have, and take all this information together and and look to the future to see what is it that we're going to want to get from these forests and what kind of condition are they in, and how damaged were they when they were logged in the past or from a forest fire. So what can be done to help those ecosystems restore themselves as well. So I got my links to my YouTube channel there, where I've got some of my other presentations out there, and this presentation will be on YouTube, so I can drop that onto my playlist as well. That is it. There's my email if anybody has any questions, and we can go to questions. So let me just